it's a vehicle, it's a legal construction, which is with an intention of unifying or like putting purpose first and then putting like gathering resources for this thing. And so the two components that it has from a legal point of view is an association, a non-profit association, and a limited company. And these two are connected in a number of different ways. I think the most important, probably two connections are there's a 10% ownership stake that the association holds. And the second part is that the association has a right, those 10% kind of give them, we employ the association to appoint 50% of our board in the limited company. So the limited company is partly governed by people that have mainly joined the exploration for the non-profit side. So they're very much looking out for and are driven by the purpose motivation. They're there for that particular point. And so that relationship allows us to have some sort of democracy in the company, because normally companies are not democratic. It allows us to have something that puts into conversation the economic lens, like the profit perspective, and the purpose, the ideal perspective, like this idea that we are trying to put into the world. And hopefully that will generate some tension, that will generate some friction, and that friction can be put to use skillfully if we can kind of have that conversation in a generative way together, not sort of either start agreeing with each other or start yelling at each other. If we can hold that middle ground and like really see that there's validity and we need to allow for like these different perspectives, like it becomes like a way of including like the both and perspective. It's not either this or that, it's both. And that will, what we think and what I've seen in my life, give more life, more value, more everything, that just increase the potential. The connective tissue, if you will. I think that's sort of the last point that I would bring in. That's sort of the third part. And from a legal point of view, it doesn't exist, right? But it is a constitution that we have decided to call like a source code. We just labeled it. That's a source code for both of these entities, that both of these entities share. And that's like a container for these two. We have two circles and then like a circle that's holding that whole thing together. And that's the source code. And that's just touching on principles, it's touching on what we're aiming to do, what is sort of the basic problem that we're addressing, what are the key mechanisms for our interactions. And it's really as little as possible to give as much freedom as we think that we could manage in these two entities, but still to just set a direction and a frame and take responsibility for those basic things. So we have ways of interacting in this entity.
If your purpose is just to make money, you shouldn't set up an RCO. You should just start a company. But if there's another purpose, whatever that may be for you, you start with that. You put that into the source code document, the constitution, and then that trickles into a limited company and a non-profit association. And the association honors the purpose, and these two entities are connected. Like you skillfully described, the association has a say in the business. It can't take over the whole thing, but it has a say. And it's there to safeguard the purpose. So it's not all about business. It's still about purpose. And that's the core structure of it. And then there are some additional options to it that you can add. So the initial RCO is one association and one limited company. But you can add more limited companies to the same RCO if they share the same purpose. The business can be vastly different, but as long as this purpose is the same, you can connect them all to the same nonprofit association and basically just create more energy in the system without it becoming just one thing. So it's not everything turns into one company. It's we share a purpose and we are trying to support it in different ways through different businesses. That to me is also an addition that's also not a must, but there's potential there. And then quite obviously in the times that we live, where a lot of new financial systems and currencies are being explored, Web3 blockchain and so on. This kind of structure lends itself, probably at least, quite nicely to that. It could be connected to DAOs, it could be connected to its own currency supporting a purpose and so on.
It really has to do something with like the society that we live in, which is very creation and birth and like light and ascent oriented. And the way that we've been looking at living systems, we've been looking at them, you know, one way of saying it, fancy word, is like it's a dissipative structure. Another way of saying it, like it seems like there are three phases in most living systems. It's like a birth phase, a growth phase. There's some sort of sustaining phase, like a maturation phase. Like there's minor changes going on, but you're not like really growing that much anymore. And then there's a decay phase, like a death phase, ultimately. And so we've put that into the company as well. And the regenerative community organism, it's like there's a clue there, the organism part. That's how we think about it. So what if this thing is actually living? What if this thing is actually a collection of living beings that are living together under this umbrella, like through this thing? And so when we are created, when we create this thing, we put this on the market, we are going to have to grow to some sort of size that feels reasonable, probably. That's big enough, if you will. And what happens then? Well, we're probably going to have to mature, and then there might be so that we're generating a surplus. What can we do with that surplus? Perhaps we can, to borrow sort of the garden analogies, like can we store that into the soil? Can we put it back into the soil? And the way that we think about the soil then is the association. Association is like where the community is gathering, where we are passionate about this topic, and there might be needs for us to do research projects, or maybe there's like a new business idea that wants to start that doesn't have anything to do with the first business, but it's like a different company or something like that. So we're pushing these resources into the soil, into the association, probably as an investment company. And then giving this investment company like an idea of like, please deploy these resources in a wise way to support the purpose in the best way. And then eventually, as the soil is kind of getting stale and like maybe it's you know, people are moving elsewhere, the rains have gone, like maybe there's been erosion in that way, to stick with the analogy, then there's a way for us to distribute what's left. And so then there's a decay phase, like where we can actually kill this thing. This thing gets to die, and it dies in such a way that it's actually buried in the ground, and in that ground it will completely decompose. And so we're redistributing all the resources, all the people, all the potential IP, all of these things, again, instead of them sort of going away into a cabinet somewhere or being locked up somewhere and somebody else keeps making money or like extracting from them, we'll give them back to the ecosystem so that they can start sprouting new plants and start sprouting new, it could become a new meadow where there needs to be a meadow at that point, if you will, because surroundings might have changed.
And to add one tiny detail there, so we start with two entities, limited company, nonprofit association. If you add the life cycle, then towards the end of the life cycle, in the fertilization/death process, we use a third entity, which is a time-limited foundation. So it's a foundation structure, but with a set time. So you only have 5 or 10 or 20 years, whatever you decide at that point, to redistribute all the remaining resources and assets to your surrounding ecosystem. And it might be worth mentioning that these three entities are really common in most legal jurisdictions around the world, which should mean that the RCO should be viable in most jurisdictions